the control room.
Okay.
So I'll be talking to that camera. When you're replying, for the most part, they'll take a shot of just Hello and welcome to the nonprofit world. I'm Jerry Valencourt. Parts of the eastern United States and the central U.S. experienced one of the coldest waves of December through January in many, many years, if not in history. On January 7th, for example, of this year, Hartford was one of just a dozen cities in the Northeast that set new record low temperatures. As a result, homeless shelters across the country were pushed to their limits. At the same time that the Dow Jones Industrial Average was setting record highs, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development reported that the population of homeless people in America was up for the first time since 2010. These are challenging times in solving the issues of homelessness, but there are some positive stories too. So we're glad that you've joined us today to hear those stories. Our guest today on the Nonprofit World, Brian Baker. He not only knows the status of the homeless situation here in Connecticut, but nationally, but he's also on the front lines of doing something about it. And he's the assistant director of the South Park Inn on Main Street in Hartford, where he's been for decades, so he knows his stuff. The mission of the South Park Inn is to assist homeless people to improve their life situations. It provides temporary and long-term housing and supportive services, and they also advocate for solutions to homelessness. Brian, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Jerry, thank you. Thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it. Started at South Park Inn in the very beginning as a volunteer. Came into work in their clothing room to separate cottons from polyesters. So that was back in 1984. So although that would be all vintage clothing now, right? The 60s and 70s stuff. But we never thought we were going to be there for more than 4 or 5 years. It was homelessness really peaked in the early 80s across the country, not here just in Connecticut, but across the country, and there was a need for more homeless shelters. So folks got together from the faith community, folks who are already doing this kind of work, and folks from the business community got together and they formed the Hartford Coalition for Emergency Shelters, Inc. And they approached the South Park Methodist Church. And the church was there from 1872 until 1982. And so built right after the Civil War, across from the South Green in Hartford, which is actually on the maps of Hartford, when they drew Hartford in 1633. So it is notably the oldest park in the nation. So that little South Green saw witch trials and Revolutionary War camp and so forth as time went on. So the church is a historic piece of property, and the Methodist Church was there and thriving for all those 110 years. And they, because the neighborhood changed, became very Hispanic. The folks that were in the Latin community are Roman Catholics or evangelical or Presbyterian, or not Presbyterian, but Pentecostals, mostly. They ended up joining the church on Farmington Avenue. So we acquired the building in 82. We opened up the shelter in 84, and even before we opened, people were already sleeping in it, and it was filled in 3 days, and we've been 24/7 for 34 years, and proud and honored to be able to do that work.
It's surprising to me to hear that the first homeless shelter in Hartford was in the 1980s. Certainly there were people suffering from homelessness before that. What's the history?
Well, actually, I'm glad you pointed that out, because the Open Hearth mission actually dates back to the 1880s. So they actually they were there before everybody else, preceded everybody else, and that was like kind of like modeled after the Bowery missions. and getting these guys that had alcohol problems or addiction problems, and getting them a place where they could work, they could live, and they could work on improving their life. So in the 80s, besides the Open Hearth, my sister's place opened up. The Immaculate Conception Church turned into a shelter. We turned into a shelter. And Mercy House across the street from us at 118 Main Street turned into a shelter. We have one of the largest concentration of homeless people in the state of Connecticut in the south into Hartford. So between us and McKinney and Open Hearth and Immacare, now it's Immacare, it was Immaculate, shelter hundreds of people a night. We're the only shelter in Hartford that has men, women, and children in the same place. So we actually have 118 beds in the old church that we're in. And we have another house called Plumpton House. We have 35 chronically homeless men and women that live there permanently. So on any given night, we're sheltering 153. And we have 15 kids in the shelter now. We have 3 pregnant women in the shelter with their children, and are there. And if you ask most of our folks 6 months ago if they ever thought they'd be homeless, they said absolutely not. This is not going to happen to me. But when people say they're a paycheck away from being homeless, it's true. I mean, life's expensive, and folks that are living with us, a lot of them are working, and they're working these part-time, seasonal jobs too, and not getting benefits, and they're making a minimum wage, and it doesn't matter the zip code that you're living in. Housing is not cheap. Affordability is a big issue.
What are some of the misconceptions that are commonly faced by people who are homeless? What do people get wrong about people who are homeless?
What I enjoy is having folks come in, and we have dozens of churches and synagogues and civic groups, dozens and dozens, that come in and actually do our evening meal. So almost 90% of our time it's done by somebody from the outside. And you hear it all the time, that people, when they come in to serve, that they're realizing that if they saw that person on the street, they would not think that person was homeless. They're not the ones pushing the carts, at least not the majority of them. They're not wearing 5 overcoats. They look like you and I. And those folks that are using our services, it's quick that people realize that that could be you or I.
It seems to me that one of the things about the term homelessness, or just homeless, you could replace the word home for other things. For example, jobless. It seems that somebody who is homeless, that's not the only thing that's not going right in their lives. And that's got to complicate the entire situation of cracking homelessness, of overcoming it.
Well, that's right.
What are some of those other things?
Well, you have a big part of the population that actually are disabled. So you have folks that are suffering from some degree of mental illness. That's 40 or 50% of our population. You have folks that suffer from addiction, alcohol and drugs. And you have homeless veterans. We have 10 beds set aside just for veterans. We run a weekly drop-in center just for homeless vets and vets in need. And the VA's there every week, and the American Legion's there every week. We see 20 to 30 veterans a week that come through our drop-in center. So you have a significant number of folks that have served in our military that find themselves, because of PTSD and other reasons, a changed person. So you have that. You have a lot of single moms with kids. So mom is usually mom and dad, so she's running the whole show. And it's, if she has no income and she's off state assistance, then she really has nothing. And we talk about the welfare state. We lost welfare. We ended welfare in 1995. So a single person that's not disabled, they have zero income from the government or from state assistance.
When you say we ended welfare in 1995, could you explain?
Well, back then.
That was a law passed during the Clinton administration.
That was during
correct?
the Clinton. That's right. And it was really trying to get welfare to work. And those folks that needed that and were able to do that, it was good. It was good for them. That was, but that was something that we did as a society to get people off assistance, right? So the whole culture of assistance changed. But we also had a lot of folks that were disabled that just couldn't do that. And then we lost our public housing too. So whatever you thought about it, good or bad, all our housing projects went away too. So that affordability of where a family could come into the shelter and within 2 weeks I could get them a house or a place to live and public housing also went away. So so you have those different things converging at the same time.
Just in the few minutes we've been chatting, you've opened up a number of areas that we can be talking about, and I certainly want to. But I'd also like to hear about your story. You've made a career working in a nonprofit, and not only do you still enjoy it, but you're still enthusiastic about it. What began your career working on the topic of homelessness? As I understand, a veteran was involved.
Yeah, absolutely. What happened to me is I went in the seminary. I went to St. Thomas Seminary in Bloomfield, and I was studying to become a priest. But at the same token, the same time, the shelter opened, and they needed volunteers, so I got involved there. I didn't go on to priesthood, but that was my gateway right there to get involved with helping out the homeless and who we found on the streets, and then a couple years after that, became a social worker, and graduating from Central Community College, or Central State College, now university, and had a homeless veteran that showed up at the door, housed him, and I got him an application to the Rocky Hill Veteran Home, and we got him down there for an intake, and he was all clear to go in, and then they came out and they said, "This guy's can't stay in." I said, "Why not?" He goes, "An hourly discharged veteran." He goes, "He's overweight." So basically what happened is like the folks in Rocky Hill in that culture at that time, this is the 80s, were really discriminating still against our Vietnam vets. And but we turned that around and did rallies, and then fast forward to 2008, the VA actually moved out of Hartford. They moved to the Newington campus, so that's how we started our drop-in center. So that's how we do our weekly drop-in center. So we've been heavily invested helping veterans and the veteran service organizations out there, the American Legions, the VFWs. When they know what you're doing and you're helping out vets, they got your back, and they have now for years. So getting supplies in, helping with housing, helping move vets out of the shelter. This has been absolutely terrific. We shelter between 100 and 150 veterans a year.
Where veterans are concerned, do you see a change in attitudes among the general public, more welcoming than it was the end of the Vietnam War?
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. But you have a whole generational shift now too, right? We've been at war for 18 years. So we have a lot of young vets that are coming back doing multiple tours, male and female veterans, with their own particular issues and being young. So yeah, you definitely have a lot of challenges now with this generation of veterans that we really need to pay close attention to. And you have to understand is you're really in for the long haul, because it's there's lots of issues, and job security is a big issue, and veterans isolating and veterans needing the support of other veterans. That's what the beauty of the drop-in center is. Like, we're doing that, and we're getting a lot of support from the veteran community, and it's just been a real honor to be able to do that kind of work.
Overall in America, on a typical night, how many people are homeless?
It's in the millions. It's in the millions, and it's bad here, but it's worse in a lot of other places. New York City, San Diego, Seattle. They're facing droves of homeless folks, and their attitude's a little different than we have. I think the nonprofit world has done a great job, and volunteers and donors have done a great job kind of reducing the overall impact of that. But it's a really big issue. We're talking millions of people, that are either in homeless shelters, living on the streets, or doubled or tripled up, and nobody really knows the number. It's like and it's not finite either. It's not just you're homeless for a certain amount of time, or we're reducing it. We all have done a great job doing that, but that homeless person in the shelter now may never thought they'd be homeless just months ago.
Somebody losing a job may be dependent on how much or how little they've had in their savings before they become in need of of a shelter.
That's right. That's right. And so many people have no savings, you know, no retirement, and never expect to. You know, and life's expensive. You know, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have cable bills and cell phone bills and internet bills. I mean, we just, you know, I mean, there was a time when life was less expensive than it is now, but it is expensive for everybody. You know, the folks that we serve really do want to get back on their feet, and they come in and they're sleeping in dorms. They're in every night by 5 o'clock. Later, if they're working or going to school or doing something they need to do, but everybody's up at 6 a.m. every day, and they're sleeping. You know, our men's dorm is 45 guys in one room. Our women and kids are in 3 old Sunday school classrooms, and that's 40 beds and 3 rooms.
The classic definition of a dorm.
It's a dorm, and there's no privacy. I think that's, you know, our biggest detriment. You know, it's like, you know, we wish we could do more private rooms, but you know, nonprofits get the building they have, and this is the building we got, and we're using it to the max.
I'd like to hear you talk about, say, the 30,000-foot view of how your operation works, the South Park Inn. From where you are as the executive, I'm sorry, the assistant director, tell me about the mechanics of how it all comes together in a typical day, in a typical week. What are we likely to see?
Well, you know, you're walking into a place that was a church that houses everybody in need that finds themselves homeless throughout the state of Connecticut and beyond. You're working at an institution that runs 24/7, like your hospitals, like your police departments, like, you know, so many folks out there, you know, that work in these areas where they never close, and we've never closed, not for 1 minute, not in the 34 years we've been there. But basically, you know, folks come in and there's just a lot of need. And people that stay with us really appreciate the roof over their heads. You know, that we're able to give them bus cards to go to their appointments, and we're able to get mental health services in. And UConn Medical has been with us for 30 years. Mm-hmm. So we have clinics that run, you know, at night with them. And we have a women's clinic and dermatology clinic, and nurses come in from University of Hartford, and we have Charter Oak Clinic also there twice a week. So we have lots of other services besides what we generally do. And then we have groups that come in and do birthday parties for the kids on the weekends, and churches and synagogues and civic groups and businesses. Every major insurance company in Hartford, you know, sends a team down to do a meal or do something with us. We raise $1 million a year. To keep operating. The other $1 million or so is government, city, state money. But generally speaking, you know, you raise half your money, you know, just to keep your doors open. And so you rely heavily on volunteers and donors. So we had a legal clinic, Appleseed came in a couple months ago. So we had Dave Pitney lawyers in last Friday, and we'll have them again, you know, in February. So there's lots of folks in the community that you need to connect to doing this kind of work. And,
it's delightful to hear that legal teams will volunteer, because that doesn't sound like something that would jump out as a need for somebody who is homeless, but certainly it must, because as we were talking about, homelessness isn't the only problem they're facing.
That's right.
What sorts of services do the legal volunteers offer?
Well, they offer everything that's not criminal. So not criminal, not immigration. Those are the 2 areas that they really don't go into. But all the civic stuff, all the civilian law stuff, mm-hmm. You know, things that, you know, housing, court issues, that sort of thing. And just, you know, so they get a perspective. And talking to an attorney, free, you know, about whatever legal issue they're facing. So that's, you know, that's between them and the attorney, and we do sign-up sheets for that. And just like the medical clinic, you know, you don't want to necessarily talk to a social worker or confide yourself if you have a medical issue. You want to talk to a doctor, you know, or a nurse, you know.
That sounds like a really great symbiotic relationship between the teaching schools, medical schools in the area, and you. You offer students an opportunity to get hands-on training before they're actually allowed to work with patients, technically speaking. Is that right?
That's right. That's absolutely right, and it's very much appreciated. We have folks on our directors that actually teach at UConn, and they come down and I met a doctor. My son had a collapsed lung, pneumothorax. He had a collapsed lung, and we went to the children's hospital. This is some years ago now, and going there, the chief surgeon came out and says, "I know you from somewhere." I go, "South Park Inn." He goes, "I was a medical student there 20 years ago." And, so it's like, yeah, you're right. It helps them with their education and serving the community, but also, it's a great way to keep people out of the emergency rooms and give them, medical care on site, at the shelter. So it's been actually a win-win for everybody.
Your organization has put together a very interesting video of what goes on and how everything comes together. So we're going to take a look now at some of that video.
We're one of 3 family shelters in the city. There's us, there's Salvation Army, and there's my sister's place. We're the 3 family shelters that serve Hartford and Greater Hartford for the most part. We have 40 beds for women and children here.
I really enjoy it. I really made friends here, and it's a good environment.
People are nice. Got my own space. I don't have to, worry about my things. I'm safe.
They make you feel welcome, It's kind of hard not to want to be here,
It's a blessing to have a good hot meal.
I am very thankful for South Park Inn because they took me in, got me off the cold.
It's here if you want it, the shelter, the food, the staff, if you need the help, the proper help,
I wouldn't know what I would do if this place wouldn't be here for me and my child.
If South Park Inn wasn't here, I would probably be on a bridge somewhere, out in the street, cold, hungry.
You stay warm up there?
Not really.
No? Watch the wind a little bit, that's it?
Yeah.
How long you been out here, Miguel?
9 years.
9 years, huh?
Yeah, me and my lady.
We go out on Thursday morning from 6 to 10 a.m. or so, and we try to engage with the homeless that are living outside.
How long you been out here, Wes?
Two years in April. I stayed in Bushnell Park from about April till July, and then from July, so about a year and a half here.
Thanks, Wes. Stay warm.
When folks come into South Park Inn, myself and the other case managers here try to find out exactly what brought them to the shelter, whether it's issues of substance abuse, of financial concern, or just loss of work, things like that that lead a family or an individual to come into the shelter.
Well, here in the transitional program, the clients are able to stay here for up to 2 years. It's an array of services that we can offer our clients and deal with their issues in order for them to move on and go on to independent living.
We started back in 1982, and we opened the shelter portion of this facility in June of 1984. When we actually opened the doors to this place, it was filled in 3 days. And so we were in the shelter business full tilt. And for the first 6 months, we cooked meals for the residents in the dining room in electric skillets and crock pots and whatever else came to hand.
Green beans?
Thank you.
Salad?
No.
Potatoes?
I thought it was a great way to be able to serve the community. When I first came down here, I was amazed by the myriad of services they provide to the people of Hartford.
Just to be able to be here and just be part of being able to give and serve people and then to interact with them and have them be so appreciative, it just also makes you very thankful and very appreciative for all that you have as well.
Volunteer groups save us nearly $40,000 a year in food costs and preparation because they provide either the meal or they provide the service to deliver the meal. You can't even begin to quantify it.
Personally, coming to South Park Inn 25 years ago, it still blows me away.
I think there's a real sense of pride in the organization that we have done a tremendous amount over the years to relieve a lot of fundamental misery in our community.
This might get you to tomorrow where that opportunity that's open for you will be available.
When I went to South Park, I was with nothing, only my bed. I have my own apartment. I was years ago in a drug problem. When you have a mistake, you can stop looking back. You have nothing now, but you can focus to have something. And I'm so happy because everything I have, more or less, was South Park gift.
We have never closed, not for 1 second. Not in the 25 years we've been here. We've been here around the clock 7 days a week.
We have numbers of people that have been here for a long time. They really feel they're making a difference in the lives of the homeless clients that come through our doors.
Hopefully in the next 25 we can solve homelessness, and you know, God willing, South Park will be here as long as we need it.
You're in the company of people that are capable, viable to do things for themselves. Sometimes circumstances will put you in a position where this is not possible. This is a raft in the ocean.
So, Brian, tell me about how you service families. You've mentioned children, you've mentioned single people, but it's got to be a challenge to bring a family into a shelter because everybody in the family has different needs, be they very young, be they very old. Tell me about some of the challenges and also the services that you can provide families.
Well, you know, schooling is number one, right? So the kids are school age, and they're coming from a situation where they were housed in Bloomfield or Windsor or Wethersfield, or Hartford, and they were going to that school. That school is responsible to bring that child back to the school. So there's continuity in education. And that's huge. I mean, I'm sure we all agree that that's number one. And you'll see 3 or 4 or 5 school buses in the front of the shelter every single morning for kids to go back to school. And we have 15 kids in the shelter now. It ranges from 1 year old to 15 years old. And so there are some very particular struggles. We benefit a great deal from the community by getting free tickets to like the XL Center, Disney on Ice. I mean, things like that will improve their quality of life. You know, the things that for a lot of us take for granted, that we can go to the Bushnell and see a show, that's not a big deal. But those folks have never been in the XL Center or the Bushnell, and to be able to provide that for them with the community support is huge. But mom is usually mom and dad, and there's some degree of abuse and neglect in their past. We don't always know that, but you have to assume that they have struggled mightily to raise their family and to be there with their children. And currently we have 3 pregnant women in the shelter. One came in last week with 2 toddlers, and she's 9 months pregnant, sleeping in our dorm. So, it's not easy to be homeless, and it's not easy to be in a shelter, but people are resilient. We have our 3rd shift supervisor was up from Jamaica some years ago and had 2 children here in the States and ended up homeless after a bad relationship that went wrong and stayed in our shelter. And she was there for almost a whole year. And during that time, one of her daughters was diagnosed with autism. And she ended up finally marrying a nice guy, getting out of the shelter, getting a job, and moving out on her own. And fast forward 5 years, she comes back as a volunteer, then comes back working part-time, and now she's our 3rd shift supervisor. So she actually works full-time for us now. But this is somebody that's resilient, right? We're all resilient. We can get through war, famine, we can get through homelessness. And who better do you want on staff but somebody that actually used to sleep in that bed, and sleep in that dorm. That you need to come back and say, hey, you can get it together too. And, with enough love and support, we want to see people go forward, and we've sheltered almost 60,000 people. So, in that time, most people now are better off than they were, but we don't see an end to it because people will come in crisis, and we want to be there for them. Not only as a shelter, but as a community.
You must experience a lot more success stories like that. I would imagine that every week or so there must be something that just makes your heart burst with gladness.
Absolutely, Jerry. I'll just give you one example. We do an outreach program every week too with volunteers, also, on Thursday mornings from 6 and 10 o'clock in the morning. So we go underneath the bridges and things, and we see folks that are unsheltered. And so forth. And we had this one guy, this is some years ago now, his name was Albie. And Albie was drunk every time we saw him. And this is 7 o'clock in the morning, he was drunk. I mean, and not a nice drunk, a really kind of drunk that person should never be drinking. One day he disappears. 3 months later goes by, and we get a call from Albie. And Albie's coming out of incarceration. He got picked up on a warrant for something he did. And he says, I don't want to go back to the streets. I want to be housed. So we brought him to the shelter, moved to our then transitional program, and he had an additional 3 detoxes before actually he got himself straight, moves out, 6 months go by, and we get a letter from his daughter in Florida with pictures of him and his grandkids, saying basically, I thought my dad was dead, and I never thought I'd ever see him again. And he's been sober for over 10 years and comes back and helps run our AA and NA meetings. And this guy was a machinist in Bristol. So he lived in Bristol, had a family, had a bad divorce, and just never hit bottom. He just all the way through those floors to a point where we never thought he would ever improve his state in life, but he did. So yeah, so that's a total success, that somebody now that walks the streets, has his family back, has his life back, and we are part of that, and we're part of that because of what we do, but also because of our volunteers and donors too that help us, help us in the community. And I can barely go anywhere without meeting somebody that has somebody that in their family or they know that have suffered from addiction or homelessness or that. I mean, I was in West Simsbury and doing a talk at a golf course to a well-heeled senior women's league guild, and I never thought I thought I'm so far removed from what I do in Hartford for where I am now. That I thought, they just weren't quite ever going to understand this. And at the end of the talk, and at the end of our time there, a woman came up to me and says, my daughter's an alcoholic and she lives on the streets of San Francisco. And so it's like, it's just, we're all touched by folks in our lives, if not ourselves, by folks in our lives that are suffering from something that might, end up, have them end up homeless. And we've had recently Permatex in and travelers in for tours and doing community service stuff, and both occasions I met somebody that had their mother or their brother or their son or daughter experience drug addiction, homelessness, and so forth. So yeah, it's not far removed, just isn't.
Let's talk a little bit about affordable housing. I have read that we are really in a crisis stage right now in this country, especially in the larger cities, where people are preferring to live in cities, and laws of supply and demand. The more people who move into a city, the more stress there is on housing that's out there, and as a result, the cost of housing goes up. How has that affected homelessness?
Well, affordability is where it's at, really. I mean, folks that could afford housing, and have decent paying jobs, they're not going to find themselves homeless. Money's everything, and you have so many folks that are just living right on the edge of being homeless. And housing, no matter what zip code you're in, it's no cheaper. In different sections of the city or a community that experience high crime rates, housing is no cheaper. So you have lots of folks out there that are just squeaking by. And affordability is everything. It just is. And we have less of that. My wife's family's from Brooklyn, and where she lived in, in her neck of the woods in Brooklyn and Sunset Park, changed completely around. I mean, it's just like, stuff that was very affordable now is, townhouse or brownstone, as they call it, is hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's like, and if you can't, you can't make it there, then, where are you going to go? You're going to end up working 2 or 3 jobs, and just to afford life.
Just to give a little bit of background to what you were saying, I read that the National Alliance to End Homelessness, I'm sure a group that you're very familiar with, said that, and this was just last month, that cities across nations are facing an affordability crisis. In the 100 largest cities in America, 80 of them have seen rents go up faster than the rate of inflation and ahead of hourly earnings. So it's a race that people on the edge are losing.
Well, that's right. That's right. You know, Hartford, where we're at in Hartford's really a second-tier city. You know, you have Boston, you New York, you San Diego's, your LA, you San Francisco's, your Atlanta's. You know, those are all first-tier cities, and places like New York is just so expensive. You know, you go to Seattle, it's so expensive. You know, I mean, and great paying jobs if you can get them. If you can afford them, if you have the education, the experience, and you have the skill set that they're looking for, but if not, you're making minimum wage or just above it, and it's just so expensive. And you're right. I mean, real estate in your urban areas now, comes with with high prices, because that's where a lot of our folks want to live. Yeah, it's just an expensive thing to do.
Let's bring it down to the personal level for a second. There's probably no one profile of the typical homeless person, probably no such thing. But in terms of demographics, age, gender, et cetera, what are we talking about? You mentioned veterans is a large portion of large percentage, but tell me about the people that you meet overall in general.
Okay. Overall, in general, if you have 100 people in the shelter on any given night, less than half of those folks are from Hartford. So the other half, or plus, the other half, are from everywhere else. So I live in Enfield, and there's no shelter from Hartford to Enfield. So you have many communities that have no place for folks to go to. We used to have, town farms, and we used to have poorhouses, right? We don't have any of that anymore. So a town or a city or a municipality doesn't take care of their own like they did at one time. And that's, and Hartford understands that, and they're always saying, hey, we need to share this burden of social services. And I agree with them. But when you have institutions like South Park and another 6 shelters in Hartford, well, that's where people go. There's one shelter in East Hartford, and there's, shelter in Bristol, and there's shelter in New Britain, but, it's a handful of communities actually are doing this kind of work. So typically,
overall, getting back to that typical 100 people in a shelter, how many of them are women? How many are men? What are their age groups?
Our shelter is 40 women and kids. So we have 15 kids in shelter now, living in our first of 3 dorms for our women and children. And so there's an additional 20 plus women that are single. They're living there. In our men's shelter, we have 45 beds for guys. Male population is generally higher than the female population on the streets. And our transitional veteran beds / respite beds, we have respite beds now at Hartford Hospital. That's an additional 33 beds. So folks that are up there are coming right out of hospital. And it's a 211 system now. Now, if somebody's homeless, they'll call 211. And they have to. You can't just walk into a shelter anymore.
I see.
And they'll call 211, and they'll actually be sent to an appointment to be diverted from homelessness. And then if they still are homeless and have no place to go, they'll actually be sent to a shelter. And the waiting list right now for somebody on that list is 800 people, men, women, and kids.
800?
800 people. Yes, we have overflow shelters that open up, or warming centers that open in the winter, and the Willie Ware Center on Windsor Street in Hartford, which is near CRT, which is not far from downtown. It's got 50 or 60 people a night, men and women, sleeping in chairs, no showers, no food, maybe some snacks, no case management, but it's a place for them to go to get out of the cold and keep from freezing to death. So beyond the capacity, the several hundred beds capacity in the shelter, you still have warming centers. Not only in Hartford, even my town in Enfield has one.
What's the impact of domestic violence in your population?
It's huge. abuse and neglect in this population is huge. You know, the evils of poverty and all that brings is huge. We have a whole DV, domestic violence shelter network, that's separate from our shelters. You have shelters in Hartford that are not listed of where they are because of domestic violence and all that brings. And you have even a domestic violence shelter in Enfield. So those shelters are packed too. So we actually have an overflow of folks that are coming from there to our place. And then we recently lost St. Agnes Home. You know, it was in the paper this weekend that they're going to close after 100 years. And that will shelter for teenage women with their teenage girls about to have birth. So there's some big changes there. But domestic violence has always been, very big. And working with them, and then working in a shelter has men in it too. So we really try to steer domestic violence folks that are suffering from that to the DV shelters.
Talk to me about other nonprofit groups in the area, not so much medical schools, that sort of thing, but other groups who are looking out for the social welfare. You must be in interaction with them constantly.
Absolutely. I was just at a meeting with the Alliance for Nonprofits. We met at the Oak Hill School just earlier today. And there was 90 people in the room from all sorts of different nonprofits.
What's the mood?
The mood right now it's devastating. Things have never been so bad. The 34 years I've been doing this, I've never seen things as bad as they are now with government assistance. I mean, there's only so many public dollars out there to go around to all the nonprofits. And folks that are doing this kind of work, not only homelessness, but all other services that nonprofits offer to folks. There's only so much public money. You give to your church or your synagogue, and you have 4 or 5 maybe nonprofits that you want to help out, Make-A-Wish or whoever. But there's a limit to what any person or family can do. So 50% of our money is government money, and we rely heavily on the state and the feds to help us out with close to $1 million a year. And right now we're probably down $575,000 for this year's budget. We're going into our reserves, and I just met with Representative Hall, who was at the Alliance for this meeting, along with other state reps, listening to our concerns that, that not only if we go away, things will be worse, but, nonprofits like South Park Inn raises a ton of money. We raise $1 million a year and have thousands of volunteers, that come in, through our door to help improve the quality of life for the folks that we serve. So we really are a community-based organization. And in the best of years, when things were going well, breaking even was the best you could hope for. And in the few years that we did even better than that, we put that money in reserves, and we have about $1 million in reserves, and we're going to start eating right through that this year, unless things change. So people have to understand that, not only South Park Inn, but a lot of other nonprofits out there are really hurting. And then we have a new tax code issue that's in place now that you will deduct less money from your taxes if you give to charitable organizations. So those are some really big issues that are going to be coming our way, and in the way of other nonprofits.
In addition to the services that you provide, shelter, et cetera, you're also very active in working on ways to end homelessness.
Yes.
Talk to me about the things you do to help lead the people who come to you to the point where they no longer need your services, which is probably the best outcome of all.
Well, just like we're doing now, having this conversation and letting the public know, what South Park Inn does. I mean, advocacy and education is huge, because you're right. Because in the very beginning, we talked about, what is a typical homeless person, and dispel those myths. That if you don't know, if you're not in a particular industry or you do a particular thing, you have your own prejudices, right? I mean, we have preconceived notions of what we expect here or there. and so forth. So advocacy is huge. We're at the state capitol all the time. The folks that run the Veterans Committee, the Senator Flexer and Representative Hennessy and so forth, and the other members of the Veterans Committee do a Help a Hero once a year for us. So they have a Humvee that comes up from the National Guard, park it right in front of the Capitol, and the legislators come down and donate. And so we'll actually have a conversation with 100+ legislators, over that period, that day, of folks that are concerned about what's going on in the community. So, you have to advocate for the folks that you serve, and help them improve their quality of life. But also the stigmas around it. Hey, these folks could be you, they could be me, they could be anybody else. Addiction or loss of job or anything like that, could bring somebody an accident. Somebody goes through a car windshield and gets traumatic brain injury. They're this person 1 minute and then they're somebody else the next minute and disabled, right? My dad had a brain aneurysm when he was 50, about my age, in the mid 80s. And, he raised 6 boys and had 44 units of housing and a full-time job and, a full life. And then, one day you have a brain aneurysm like he did and completely disabled ever since. So yeah, things happen to people. And, if people understand, the folks that we're serving and that the folks that we're serving in the shelter appreciate being there, they're guests, they act like guests, the vast majority. They're not the gangbangers out there, they're not the ones selling drugs or robbing people. These are the ones that are really more victims than anything.
I would imagine that your guests also learn lessons while they're there. Maybe some practical ideas and ways of life that can help prevent them from coming back.
That's right. We actually have different workshops during the week. So we have an employment workshop. Teach people how to present yourself in an interview, right? Tape people doing that, and we have credit counseling that comes in. We have a group out of Boston that comes in every week, and they talk about the practicalities of money management. And that's what a lot of people don't have. Managing your dollars. There are few or many. It's all about managing your dollars. And my former boss would always say, take care of the pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves, right? And it's that practicality and running the ANA meetings by formerly homeless folks, coming in and part of recovery is mentoring, and that's a big deal, and help people with their life list. There are all sorts of groups that come in to help out, here or there, and they do drives for us because they, people come in with a bag or two of stuff, and that's all their worldly possessions. So they'll come in and they'll do a toiletry drive, or hygiene supplies, personal care items, socks, underwear. I mean, all that stuff that most of us just take for granted, that you have a decent pair of shoes to wear.
Right.
That don't have holes in them.
The world for somebody.
Yeah, and if you have nothing in your wallet and you have no plastic, nothing to charge, your alienation is just huge. Strip yourself of everything you have, your title, your job, your career, your family, and it's just like, and reduce yourself to nothing. That's the world of the people that we serve.
Considering the need, it must be, and that what you can offer is outstripped by the demand. How do you make the decisions? What are the criteria that you apply to, who is able to spend the night with you? Well,
it's a 2-on-1 system now. So we really get, unless we have them, we find them on outreach.
I'm sorry, the 2-on-1 system is what, for those of us who
it's a state system. I'm sorry. If somebody's homeless, we're in need of anything. It's InfoLine. And it's supported by United Way. And it was really set up a few years ago to try to get a real handle on the amount of people who are homeless, and those sorts of things, and resources. So it was implemented by the state. So folks can't just walk into a homeless shelter now. They got to call 211. So they call 211 and they say, hey, I'm homeless, if they have a phone or they're using somebody else's phone. And they communicate that to them. And then they're basically set up with an appointment saying, hey, tomorrow come to the diversion center and then be interviewed And then if we find at the end of that interview you really need shelter, we're going to put you on a waiting list for shelter. And there's hundreds of people on that waiting list. So what the shelters do is they look up that waiting list, and and you go from the top of the list, folks that are most in danger, that are sleeping in a car or sleeping in an unsafe situation, and you call them for shelter. If they answer, then we have them in if we have a bed. So it's a tough situation that they actually find themselves in, unless they're a veteran or unsheltered. They have to go through that system.
If someone's watching this right now and says to themselves, I would like to help, what sort of opportunities as individuals can people offer to you?
Well, we take a lot of volunteers and donors and folks that are doing all sorts of cool stuff out in the community that really want to help. And the vast majority of folks that work for us actually were volunteers at one time or another. And I never thought in '84 working in the clothing room that I'd be sitting here with you, right? But the opportunities are great. I mean, folks from the community have especially folks that if you're not doing the work, you have a new, fresh set of eyes, on what we're doing, and people come up with some terrific ideas all the time. And they can go to our website, www.southparkin.org. And we were there long before that TV show was around, the original South Park.
There really is a South Park, Colorado.
Yeah, I know.
In
Texas too.
Okay.
So we have a really giving community. We really do. This nation is very, very giving, and they understand the plight of folks that we serve, not personally, but we all know. I mean, how far are we, any of us, from catastrophe of one kind or another? That's why folks join the military when they're 18, because they think they're invincible. When they get to our age, they're like, well, invincibility is not in question anymore.
Things change, obviously. I know you're using social media, as you mentioned, but there used to be a day when there were many more large employers, and donations for employees would sometimes be going through the United Way.
Yes.
And you could go to one meeting and talk to hundreds of people at once with your story. That's not so much the case anymore, is it? You can't talk in one event to as many people as you used to. So what do you do to get the word out?
Well, we're one of two shelters in Hartford to actually benefit from United Way of Northern and Northeastern and Central Connecticut. That's our local United Way. It's the biggest United Way in the state of Connecticut. We roughly receive $100,000 or $150,000 a year from our United Way. That's part of our private donations. So we speak on behalf of United Way. United Way has been absolutely wonderful to us and all the other sister organizations that take care of the folks that we take care of too, right? So we're all in this together. We're all part of the same community, doing this sort of thing. But you still need a thriving business community. That's where you get your money from, right? Business does well, we do well, and that's always the point. Is to go out there, have the folks at Pratt & Whitney, the folks from various organizations understand the work that we're doing. And
even the New England Patriots were by not that long ago to give you a thumbs up and a help.
That's right. The last regular season game with the New England Patriots versus the Jets, or one of the last games, it was really cold, and people were able to bring blankets in, and then they made an announcement at the end of the game. They said, hey, if you want to donate your blanket to a homeless shelter in New England, we'll take them, we'll clean them, we'll wash them, we'll dry them, we'll fold them, and we'll bring them to those various shelters. So we picked out one shelter in every state. We were lucky that we got picked by the Patriots, and the Patriots came down and with the cheerleaders and the mascot and a couple ex-players came down and gave us some real joy. It was fun. It was just a lot of fun, to have the Patriots there. But they're just one of so many organizations and businesses and churches and civic groups that are really, really, really helping us out. I mean, our hardest thing right now is the state budget. That is by far the hardest thing we're facing, but the entire state of Connecticut's facing, right? Social services, education, everything's on the line. And there's nothing sacred now.
Would you say that's your biggest priority right now of everything that's on your desk, advocating at the government level for essentially your future?
That's right. That's right. We've lost several $100,000 this year. Not only us, but everybody else too. But we've been impacted severely by the loss of money from HUD. It was $275,000 for our transitional program, where guys could graduate from the shelter to their own cubicle in the sanctuary of the old church, the old Methodist church we're in. That money is gone now, and then the state support for that money is gone. Our Plumpton House, where we have 35 chronically homeless men and women, it costs us $600,000 a year to run that house. We raised $400,000 privately, but we still relied heavily on the state for the other $200,000. And we're really advocating hard now to restore some of that money to our programs.
You mentioned Plumpton House. I didn't mean to interrupt. What distinguishes Plumpton House from the South Park Inn? What's special there?
Basically, what we do is we're taking chronically homeless people off the streets and realizing when they're in shelter that living independently is not good for them, that you really need to be in a communal, place.
I see.
And Plumpton House was a home for the aged, or a residential care home. Got defunded and closed in the 80s, and they approached us, South Park Inn, in the late 80s to buy the facility. And so we did. We purchased it because a lot of our formerly homeless folks would end up in this home for the aged. And we bought the building with some state money, renovated it. It was an 1860s mansion, 22 rooms. Formerly owned by the Plumpton family, who had a stationery company that sent out letters through their stationery to all the war dead, to the Civil War, to the families.
Oh my!
And
there's history in just about everything.
There's history everywhere, right? Harvard's full of it. And if you were anybody back in the day, you didn't live in Farmington. You didn't live in Simsbury or Avon. These are all, these are all cow farms or whatever. You lived in Asylum Hill. You lived in Hartford. And he had this beautiful mansion and a whole row of mansions, not far from Harry Beecher Stowe and so forth.
Mark Twain.
And Mark Twain, right? Mark Twain was noted to come by the house from time to time to the billiard room, and
of course,
who knows? I'd love to hear that conversation. So we acquired the house in the late '80s. In '95, got totally renovated back to its former glory, and we have 35 homeless men and women there that are. Most of them are on Social Security or disabled. Some number of veterans, but it's their permanent home. And folks, some of them graduate out of there and do better and live on their own again, and some stay there forever. So it's a real homey environment. The state pays us $17 a night per head until recently. So I think you take one of those folks, put them in a nursing home, that's $200,000 plus a year, not 35. The word is nonprofits do save us a lot of money, from soup kitchens to group homes across the board. You have our folks make $11.90 an hour. You could probably make more money in McDonald's than you could working for a homeless shelter, but they do it because they want to, and our volunteers and donors do it because they want to.
Well, Brian, thank you for being the leader of a remarkable organization in the nonprofit world that really makes a difference in the lives of people as well as the community. And thank you for being our guest today on the Nonprofit World. Our guest, Brian Baker, he has been for 34 years with the South Park Inn, one of the founders of the place, and still a denizen. And as history, as we were talking about, happened in the past, I think it's happening right now with Brian. Thank you very much for being with us today on this edition of the Nonprofit World.